Hello, what a pleasure it is to be part of this very important conference on education for sustainable development. The last decades, we have seen tremendous progress from 1977 with the Tbilisi Declaration that launched the importance of environmental education, to the UN Decade for Sustainable Development, to the United Nations Environmental Programs initiatives, particularly in education, to most recently Rio 20, and now to the latest United Nations Secretary General New Education Initiative. This is a history of expanding aspirations about the purposes of education. From a time when we simply hoped to provide everyone the opportunity to have fundamental education, to a time when we hope that that education would empower individuals to be able, capable, and motivated to have the kinds of interactions with one another and with their fellow human beings around the world and with the environment that would allow us to have a sustainable world, to have peace, and to advance human rights. Education goals have always been important, starting 400 years ago, when Comenius proposed that all persons should be educated so that we could have peace in the world, and especially with the inclusion of Article 26 in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which fundamentally transformed the world from a world in which most children and youth did not have the opportunity to set foot in a school, to a world where today most of them do. So it makes a lot of sense that as we expand those goals, we will expand the opportunities to be educated. And the conception of education for sustainable development is indeed a broad and ambitious vision. But an important question to examine at this conference is what would it take to translate this vision, this broad vision, into practice? We should be asking, are we making sufficient progress in the achievement of those goals since Tbilisi '77? At sufficient speed? Should we be thinking differently about success? In too many places around the world, schools are aligned to a rather narrow set of purposes, measured with assessment instruments that assess low-order cognitive skills, which produce a crowding out and narrowing of the curriculum that translates into many students seeing their education as irrelevant to their lives, to the context outside the school. The result is that those youth check out either physically or psychologically from their schools. So that's one reason why we need an expanded, a more authentic, a more engaging vision of education. And one way to think about the kinds of skills that would make sense in the 21st century so that youth can invent the future is to think about them in three pillars, in three components. A cognitive component. This has been the traditional domain of education that includes not only knowledge, but cognitive processes and strategies, the capacity to think critically, the capacity to use that knowledge to solve new problems, creativity and innovation increasingly important. A second pillar that includes the ability to govern oneself, an intellectual openness, curiosity, the capacity to learn throughout life, a work ethic, conscientiousness, the capacity to apply oneself to doing the very best work we can do, and self-efficacy, the awareness that we are capable of achieving our goals. And lastly, the third pillar, the competencies that allow people to come together with others in search of common goals, the capacity to work in teams, to collaborate, and to lead them. These are the skills that education for sustainable development should also be developing. And to develop them, we should go much way beyond the traditional conception of curriculum, of textbook. We should think outside the textbook, outside the classroom, even outside the school. We should think about innovative approaches to promote the kind of agency, the kind of capacity to transform the world, to take responsibility for shared stewardship of a sustainable planet. And there are many innovators working at the grassroots all over the world that have produced effective programs to develop those kinds of competencies, programs and practices. And therefore, our opportunity and also our challenge is not to come up with a grand design that can be mandated from the top, from any UN agency or from governments, but to build an architecture that would allow us to identify those innovative practices and programs, to study them, and to disseminate that information, to share it widely in a global network of entrepreneurs and innovators so that we can close the gap between our expanded aspirations of education for sustainable development and the practice of schools as experienced by most students around the world. It has never been truer that a small group of people can indeed achieve great things, and this is true in education, and it is true with regards to environmental stewardship. The X Prize is an approach that has been developed by a group of business leaders in the United States to stimulate innovation, among other things, in coming up with innovative approaches to clean oil spills in the ocean. What is interesting about the X Prize, which operates in a model of a competition, is that the teams that participated in that competition have on average 40 individuals. Now imagine what that means. Relatively small groups of people are capable to do what it took large governments and organizations in the past to do. Now, what are we to do to bring those ideas, to produce the individuals capable of bringing forth this kind of transformation? We need more sophisticated models of what schools and school systems are. We need to think about them as systems and not just as curriculum or a subject or a simple book that disseminates good practices on environmental education. The slide in front of you represents a simple system to promote the development of democratic citizenship competencies. It's a system that has 3 integrated components. At the core, frequent daily opportunities for students to learn at high levels, to think, to choose, to deliberate, and to be tolerant, supported by a curriculum for democratic citizenship, enacted by teachers who are prepared to value diversity, to be themselves tolerant, and who can model democratic practices, reinforced by relationships between schools and communities that are respectful and democratic, supported by schools that themselves are democratic communities, and all of it embedded in a commitment to educate all students at high levels. This slide is a simple representation of an education system that has essentially 4 components. It's all driven by clarity of purpose, by clear goals about who should be educated and for what purposes, supported by high-quality curriculum, instructional materials, pedagogy, and teachers, sustained by effective management and leadership, by an adequate school organization, administration, and management, all of it in alignment with context, with a local context and a national context and a global context. What are the 9 components that are necessary to advance reforms in these simple systems in order to produce the kinds of 21st century skills that would allow us to have education for sustainable development? A high-quality curriculum, very high-quality instruction, supported by an adequate learning and teaching environment, supported by effective leadership, in a context of educational innovation, in a culture of continuous improvement, with adequate resources, with an environment of regulations that are effective, and in a context where there is consensus among key stakeholders about the goals of education for sustainable development. In that sense, this conference, this convening, is a very important opportunity to build that consensus. But it'd be important to remember that the education sector in too many places around the world is characterized by very low rates of innovation, by very limited resources for delivery and especially for innovation. It's a sector that is heavily regulated, which makes it difficult for entrepreneurs to either come up with innovative approaches or to scale up those approaches. Where too many teachers and schools are isolated from one another and from other institutions, where there is a lack of integration across disciplines, across educational institutions, where institutions have multiple goals and very limited consensus, very limited agreement on the priority of these goals, where the effects that we're most interested in are really long-term and not immediate effects. It's a sector that is largely credential-driven, not driven by knowledge and skills, and where the quality of teaching is too often low and ineffective. So, can we transform this sector? Can we transform this system? I believe we can. And to do that, we need to seize the benefits of scale. It is not realistic to expect that schools, which are too small a unit, can themselves have the capacity to transform themselves. We need to articulate network of schools, we need to bring them into contact with other organizations, whether they are universities or other providers of services. We need to distribute information on outcomes in ways that mobilize and energize key stakeholders. We need to establish an infrastructure that can identify and study good practice, innovative practice, and disseminate that infrastructure. Technology is an extraordinary resource to help us do that, to help us crowdsource the search for innovative practices that can sustain the development of 21st century skills. And we need to think in new ways about students. We need to think about them as agents capable of teaching not only themselves, but to teach their peers, to teach other students, and to teach their teachers. And we need especially to foster innovation and entrepreneurship in this sector, so that we can have a system that is a lot more open and a lot more capable of innovation. I wish you well in these very important deliberations designed to helping us think anew about building an architecture of education at a global level that will help us deliver on the very ambitious goals that you have set out for this meeting.